Chapter 6.
"Balance,"
the master began, "is sustained, not created," replied all the students except Lanna. She blinked, glancing at the students around her, surprised to find they were of varying ages and sizes. Maybe this was the class for struggling or new students? She wasn't expecting to be tossed a waxwood staff, told to prepare herself, and immediately confronted by the master. He went down the line of students like a whirlwind, his staff slicing through air and smacking soundly, knocking students off their feet. Once they were all on the ground, the master planted the heel of his staff into the floor and stared them down as they groaned and pulled themselves to their feet. Leanna's shoulder ached from the blow she'd taken, but she forced herself not to rub it and blinked away the tears prickling the corner of her eyes.
"See where you are now?"
said the master.
"By the end of your time at the academy, you will be almost as good as I am. This is a class for magic-wielders who don't have battle magic, which means your magic cannot be used in combat. Your training will be different from the others, and will focus more on fighting skills than magic honing."
To her relief, they put the staffs away, and the rest of the class ended up being mostly lecture and stretches. Even if she was about as flexible as a head of millet, meaning not at all, she could stretch and listen to the masters drone on about the importance of balance in fighting and in the Empire. What made her suddenly concerned was when the lecture turned from talk of balance to talk of pain.
"Pain is in the mind,"
said the master, tapping his temple.
"Pain is all in the mind. Learn to control your mind, and you will be undefeatable. Nothing will hurt you if your mind is made of steel."
This wasn't boding well for future combat lessons. At dinner, Shu came over. Leanna told herself there was no reason to be wary, no reason to grit her teeth. She made herself smile widely and greet her, even though she had been heading toward where Sedong sat by himself again at the end of the farthest table.
"Hey, Lanna," said Shu. "How was your first day?"
"It was good," she said. Except combat training. That was stressful.
"Really? I'd have thought it would be DU for sure."
"Oh, well, I thought it was very interesting. I learned a lot."
"Did they put you with the children?"
There was that strange light in Shu's eyes that raised Liana's hackles. That strange something that made her feel like she wanted to hear that Liana was struggling. But that made no sense. There was literally no reason Shu should care at all what happened in Liana's life beyond a friendly care for the newcomer. "Yes," Liana admitted.
"Yeah, don't worry about that. Usually older people skip ahead quickly enough. They just have to see if you know something or nothing."
At Shu's words, a stunningly beautiful girl next to her spewed out her water on the ground and set into a fit of choking laughter. Shu cast a glance at the girl, grinning. Liana forced another tight-lipped smile, watching as the laughter and snickers built around them while the beautiful girl laughed and wiped up the mess. "Yeah, thanks."
"Lei, what's so funny?"
asked a boy another table down. Lei whacked her chest, drew in a deep breath, coughed again, and opened her mouth to speak. Then she burst into another round of giggles. More people were leaning over now, asking what was so funny.
"It wasn't that funny,"
said Shu, even though she was clearly very proud of herself. She was right. It wasn't that funny. Lanna made her escape, drawing away and hurrying to settle down next to Sedong. He was rolling his eyes.
"I hate her," he said.
She shrugged. "I don't think she means to be the way she is."
"She definitely does."
After supper, she headed back to the dormitories. Just like the night before, she heard the laughter before she rounded that dreaded corner. Was there another way to her dormitory? Did she have to skirt around Shu and her crew again? And the prince? Her stupid heart was fluttering again, sending her palms into a sweaty frenzy. This was so dumb. She never thought herself the type to have her head turned by good looks. She hurried around the corner, but this time Shu didn't stop her. No one stopped her. She scurried by like an invisible fly, hoping that the prince didn't notice her. The latter was mixed with a desperate and wholly idiotic desire for him to notice her anyway. She needed to get her head screwed back on straight. Laughter rang behind her, and it sent something like a knife through her chest. If she was going to succeed here, she had to work hard. She paused when she reached her dormitory, seeing all the young girls talking and laughing together as they completed their ridiculous stretches. Their white robes billowed in the waning sunlight as it dipped behind the mountain above them, casting dancing shadows everywhere. Liena didn't enter her dormitory. Instead, she turned and kept walking down the path. A familiar form loitered outside what was presumably the boys' dormitories. Or one of them. He sat on the red-painted railing, his legs dangling as he picked at his lip and stared into nothing. "Hey," Sedong called, spotting her. He straightened on his perch, leaning forward. "Are you lost? Your dormitory is back that way." "I'm not going to my dormitory," she said. "I'm going to the library. Want to come?" He looked surprised, but then he shrugged. Sure, I guess." "Perfect, because I don't know where it is." He gave another shrug before hopping down from the railing. "I'll show you." When Lanna and Sedong arrived in the library, it was eerily dark. Not completely dark, as there were a few candles, but somehow the candles seemed to be fighting against the oppressive darkness, and they weren't succeeding as well as they should like. It had a very musty smell, one that seemed to dry out her nose with each inhale. Lanna picked up one of the candles by the door, surveyed the tall shelves and the low desks surrounded by mats, and sat down at a desk in a corner, away from a few other students who were already there. "What are we going to do?" Sedong asked, sitting across from her. "Study, of course. Don't you have anything to study?" He shrugged. "Not really." "Nothing?" She frowned, inspecting the inkwells and quills already set on the desk. "I have to practice the characters I learned today, and if it's all right with you, I'd like to recite to you what I remember from my history class, so I don't forget it." He blinked. "What?" she asked. "Do people not normally do this?" He squinted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, I suppose lots of other people do it. It's just that I have never done it." "You've never studied? And you've been at the academy for years? Are you very smart?" Sedong snorted, then covered his mouth and glanced around the library to make sure no one was annoyed by the sound. "I'm not smart," he said bluntly, and perhaps a little bitterly. "In fact, I'm failing most of my classes." "Failing?" Lanna cried. "And you've never come to study? Of course you're failing. Don't you want to learn?" He was grinning now, shaking his head. "You make it sound so easy and obvious." "Of course it's easy and obvious. Here, we'll start with you. Tell me what you remember from one of your classes today." "What? I don't remember anything." "That's impossible," said Lanna. Slowly, bit by bit, she coaxed out of him a few tidbits from his class. It was almost agonizing work, but she was determined. He was smiling by the end, smiling in disbelief. "I suppose I do remember some things." "All right," said Lanna, straightening her spine and fixing him with her most authoritative stare. "You need to pay attention tomorrow in class and find out what you need to be studying. It'll do you a world of good. Now, can you help me?" He started to nod, but stopped, his eyes flitting up from her to beyond her shoulder. Lanna waited, then twisted around. There, standing in the darkness, shrouded by the library door, was a tall form, a woman's form, and by the sparse candlelight, Liena could see a scarred, empty eye socket. Her mouth opened. Master Ku stared back at her and Sedong. Liena turned around, bowing over her parchment and quill. Occupying herself for several long minutes, she refused to give Master Gu the satisfaction of turning around and acknowledging her presence again. "She's gone," said Sedong. Liena let out a gust of pent-up breath. "Why in the 7 valleys was she watching us?" He shrugged. "I don't know. She's weird." "Something seems off to me about her." "Something's off for sure. Did she show you that dragon hide she has in her office?" Liena nodded, unable to help her little snicker. "Does she show everyone?" "Every single new student," said Sedong, leaning over the table and whispering around a shielding hand. "It's not even that big of a dragon." "You've seen a dragon?" "No, just heard from some of the other students who have that it's small." "Why do you think she acts like it's such a big deal? Do you think it's because she's ashamed of her eye?" "Of her magic," snorted Sedong. "Her magic?" "Yeah, her magic was feral." "Was?" "Is, I suppose, but she's here at the academy because it doesn't work as well anymore, now that her eye is gone. She lost her position in the military after that incident." "Wait, what's feral magic?" "It's, I call it animal magic. It means you were born with augmented senses and abilities. She had night vision and something else, something that made her really good at running enemy raids at night. But then the encounter happened with the dragon, and she lost her eye, so she cannot see very well anymore. I think something about the event made her supervisors mad, too, so they demoted her to working at the academy." "Are all the academy masters demoted?" "Oh no, just a few of them. Most of them are retired and were very important a while back." "That makes more sense." They studied late into the night, until Liena was nearly falling asleep sitting up. At breakfast the next morning, she was barely awake enough to scoop food into her mouth. Until a student's shout echoed through the mess hall.
"Arena battles have been posted!"
Chapter 7. Liena's heart gave a little sputter, and her hands, wound up in the folds of her sash, crept up to touch the beads at her throat. Across from her, Sedong began frantically shoveling food into his face as he stood. He made a garbled sound at her that, paired with his gesture to follow him, she took to mean, "Let's go check." "I'm not going to be on there, right?" said Liena, catching up to him. The potent smells of fish-topped congee and baozi, which had once been so appealing, now turned her stomach. Sedong's response was distorted again, his cheeks so full he looked like a chipmunk. She had no idea what he said until he shrugged. She had just gotten here. No use fretting over a battle she was almost certainly not going to fight. She tripped over the lip of the next hallway. She caught herself quickly, but not before a few snickers sounded from the crowd crammed around the huge sheets of character-filled parchment nailed to the wall by the pits. Sedong elbowed his way through the front, dragging her along behind him. "Dragons," said Sedong, swallowing his mouthful. "I'm paired with Tai. He'll beat me so bad." "You haven't lost yet," said Liena. "Maybe you'll beat him this time." "Hey, you're on here too." The blood drained from her face. "I'm there?" "Yeah, they have you competing against Wei Ling?" I haven't heard of her. At least that means she's probably not that good." But I can't fight!" "Get out of the way!" a student barked from behind them. "The rest of us want to see." "Sorry," said Liena, just as Sedong made a rude face at the bigger student. "Sedong," she hissed. "Don't provoke him." The other student shot Sedong a look, but Liena dragged him away before anything could escalate. "I can't fight," Liena said again, drawing Sedong's attention to her so he didn't keep glaring over his shoulder at the other student. "Sure you can fight," said Sedong.
We've been practicing every day for the last week, and you've been going to your combat classes each day."
"I'm doing terribly in that class," she wailed. "I thought they would give me more time. I've only been here for a week."
"Don't panic. It'll be okay. If worst comes to worst, you'll just take a blow or two and then it'll be over."
A blow or two? How hard were these blows? Would she be injured? Memory of Master Gu's words made unease crawl up her spine. About the student who died in the arena battles. "Sedong, Master Gu said that there was a student who died in the arena last year. Aren't the masters supposed to keep that from happening?"
"Well," he said, "it's very rare. The masters do intervene to keep that from happening, but they can't stop everything. Sometimes there are accidents, and sometimes there are accidents."
He wiggled his eyebrows as if she should know exactly what he meant. "What do you mean, accidents?" Lanna found herself gripping the railing with white knuckles, looking out at the sandy pits and the few students who were squeezing in more practice before class. Most were still clumped around the posting like a flock of white doves in their uniforms, ready to fly south for the winter.
"That student who died last year?" said Sedong, leaning his elbows on the railing and letting his hands dangle over the edge. He squinted against the rising sun. "Well, the other student really had it out for him, and the masters didn't know. The students did. They knew how much they hated each other. So, when they were paired in an arena battle, the masters didn't think anything of it. They just thought they were fighting extra hard. But a lot of us students saw it for what it was."
Did his jaw just tick?
It was too late by the time the masters realized the same thing.
He blinked, shook his head, and his tone sounded perhaps just slightly too casual to be convincing.
"You're safe, though, because you don't have any enemies."
No enemies. Right. It wasn't as comforting as Sedong intended it.
"It'll be fine," he said, reaching out and giving her shoulder a squeeze. "You still have until tomorrow."
That wasn't very comforting either.
"I've done some research for you,"
said Sedong, catching up to her in the mess hall later that day.
"Your opponent is another seer, so you don't have to worry about magic. Plus, she's only 12.
What is better, being beaten by someone your age or someone several years younger?" asked Liena sourly. Sedong laughed, and it only made her frown more.
"You never know what is going to happen. These battles are kind of crazy. Things happen all the time and the underdog wins."
"You stink at offering comfort." He looked sheepish.
"Sorry."
"Instead of studying after supper, can we practice more?" He shrugged.
"Sure."
When they went out to practice after supper, the pits were already full. Why did everyone have the same idea as her? She trudged behind Sedong to the armory, which flanked the pits. Inside, the low-ceilinged, darkened room held all manner of weapons and practice weapons. A master with his head tilted back and a long beard trailing down past his waist stood at the entrance and watched their perusal of jians, broadswords, both wooden and real, knives, and waxwood staffs. It was very orderly. Lanna had already had several classes now on weapon respect and care. They'd been admonished in strong language to honor these weapons, both in their training and when they went to return them. There was even a table to one side with tools for sharpening and cleaning.
"You're going to be fighting with a waxwood staff," said Sedong, grabbing two from the rack. "It's good for defense."
He tossed one to her. She fumbled to catch it, then glanced self-consciously at the narrow-eyed master watching. She straightened, biting the inside of her cheek, and gripped the staff in both hands. "How do they even decide who wins?" she asked as they left the armory and entered the pits.
"They have to incapacitate you."
Liana's eyes widened in alarm.
"Not like that," said Sedong, growing impatient. "They have to get you, Here, fall over."
"I'm not falling over." He shot her an exasperated look. She glared back.
"Fine, I'll fall over," he said.
He crouched on the ground, then laid himself flat in the sand.
"Now grab your staff and stand over me."
She stood next to him.
"You just beat me in a fight. Act like it. Shove the staff in my face or something."
She poked his belly with it. He huffed and contracted his abdomen, knocking aside her staff and rolling into a sitting position. His brow was lowered.
"You're useless. You've got to show that you've gained mastery over your opponent. You'll never win if you act like that."
Was he genuinely upset with her? She wasn't sure. What she really wanted to ask him was if he'd ever won an arena battle before. Because, no offense to her friend, but she wasn't sure he had, and imagined that if she was going to get better, she would probably need another instructor. But he was flicking sand out of his hair, and she didn't want to anger him further.
"How do I fight?" she said.
"You've got to get your stance right. See, look how easy it is for me to knock you off balance."
He brought his staff up in both hands and knocked it against the underside of hers, forcing her back several steps.
"What's the proper stance?"
A new voice entered.
"You're asking him about proper stance?"
Laughter. Leanna gritted her teeth into a smile and lifted her gaze to Shu, standing with arms crossed a few feet away. 2 girls flanked her, and one was so beautiful that Leanna had to struggle to not stare. She wasn't tall, but toned and curvy, with glossy black hair and full lips. Leanna recognized her as the laughing girl from the mess hall. Had someone called her Lei?
"Would you like to show me?"
Leanna asked Shu, forcing her smile sweeter.
"Oh, sure,"
said Shu, oddly cheerfully. She snatched the staff from Sedong's hands, making the girls behind her snicker. She approached Leanna swiftly, like a tiger about to pounce on its prey. Leanna could immediately see the skill difference. She couldn't say exactly what was different, but the overall impression was one of alarming proficiency.
"Like this,"
said Shu, grinning. She adjusted her stance, not pointing out the particulars. Then she came, staff swooping in a deadly arc through the air, for Leanna. Leanna barely got her own staff up in time, squeaking. Her arms buckled on impact, but Shu cut underneath her raised arms, simultaneously sweeping her feet behind her knees and knocking her to the ground. Then Shu was crouched on top of her, pinning her legs with one knee and her elbow with the other foot. She gripped Leanna's wrist, pressing it into the sand, and held the staff above her head with her free hand. She gave Leanna a sunny smile.
"One bash with the end of this thing, and you're dead."
Leanna gritted her teeth against the pain.
"Thank you for showing me,"
she muttered, trying not to sound too sour.
"Anytime,"
said Shu, hopping off and offering her a hand. She turned to Sedong with a smirk.
"Want me to show you proper stance too?"
He shook his head, his ears scarlet. One of the girls snickered. Lei buckled over in full-on laughter. Shu tossed Sedong back his staff and winked.
"See you both tomorrow. Hope you do well."
They left. Leanna glanced over at Sedong to find him staring at the ground, his hands clenched into fists.
"Who are you fighting?"
asked Leanna. There were no classes today. It was only arena battles all day. Barriers had been erected in the pits, making little arenas that people could crowd around and watch the fighting. Sedong pointed to a boy she'd never seen before. He was lean like Sedong, but far more muscular. He stretched on the side, then worked through a series of sword moves.
"He looks pretty fierce,"
said Leanna.
"Yeah, and he's a shifter too. Shifters are the worst. They're high energy, vicious, and they fight so hard. They're not careful fighters. They just throw themselves into the fray like wild animals, even if they're super disadvantaged. And then they turn into wild animals, and it's just the worst."
"Are you going to be all right?"
He shrugged. "Yeah, I'll be fine. Let's go find your opponent."
The first battles started while they were working their way through the crowd. The moment they did, she almost couldn't keep moving. Her steps slowed as she stared wide-eyed. They were vicious. Sometimes the spectators had to duck to keep from being slammed by magic or taken out by a blow. Her feet rooted to the spot as she watched, mesmerized and horrified as her fellow students fought each other mercilessly. "Are they trying to kill each other?" she said, pointing to two students fighting in one of the nearest arenas. They were young, but Lanna had no doubt that they could win a fight against anyone in her village back home, even the grown men. "Nah." "Are you sure?" "Totally. See, that blow was meant to knock them to the ground, not kill." "It sure looked like it was meant to kill." He shook his head. "You know nothing." She shot him a look. "See how they're not talking? Usually if they're good friends or bitter enemies, they talk. But they're just focused on the fight. Plus, my magic sometimes randomly works on arena battles. I can usually tell pretty well if they're trying to kill each other." "If you say so." "Yes, I say so. Besides, they're not even using magic. Ye Min is a mind reader, so she can't use her magic in the arena. Same with Ben Thao there, who's a high seer. One of the only ones, actually. The scariest battles are the ones where they can't even have them in these arenas. Like today, one of those dirt movers, I think her name is Na, is going to battle Xian Hanying, who's a riverbender. They're taking that battle out into the wilderness later." "Are you going to watch?" "Nah, seen enough of them." He was quiet, his attention suddenly sucked into the battle. She glanced at him then, watching him curiously. In the entire last week that she'd been here at the academy, she'd never seen Sedong speak to someone other than herself unless he absolutely had to. Was she his only friend? Did he have no friends before she came? It certainly seemed the case when she arrived and found him sitting in his own corner of the mess hall. Her attention was ripped away from him as her periphery recognized a familiar form. She swiveled her head to the arena at her right. It was the prince. He faced off a block-shaped student who was already growing a beard. They circled each other in the arena, and Liena drifted closer. She wasn't the only one, either. A whole herd of students congregated around the arena to the point she almost couldn't see what was happening. It appeared that this was one of the big fights happening today. She stood on her tiptoes, trying to get a view over the two tall students in front of her. Peeking around one's elbow, she was in time to see vines explode out of the ground by the prince's feet. He leapt aside just barely, slamming a wall of fire into the earth. The vines all but exploded with the impact of the fire. His opponent used that opportunity to strike, running forward with his swinging broadsword. Liena's chest seized up. The prince deflected the blow and grinned. "It is just a battle," she told herself. They weren't trying to kill each other. Sedong appeared at her side, apparently finding this fight more interesting than the other one. "Who is the boy fighting the prince?" she asked him. "That is Tuan Wan. He's the only plant wielder alive right now. One of the top students." "He looks very fierce." Sedong scoffed. "You say that about everyone. Do you not think the prince looks fierce?" She considered the prince in the arena, launching a volley of fireballs at Wan that were narrowly dodged. His brow was knit, the tightly corded muscles of his forearms straining with the force of his magic. "He looks very fierce, too." The ensuing battle was riveting. Wan kept trying to catch the prince with his vines and restrain him. The prince kept burning his way out. She watched, biting her nails. Despite how engrossed she was, she gradually became aware of a few girls nearby talking. "He's holding back." "Who? Tuan Wan?" "No, Prince Niansu. They say he's the most powerful fire wielder to be born. Ever." That was probably an exaggeration. "His magic is so powerful that he could incinerate entire armies with the sweep of his hand." "And who told you this?" came the skeptical reply. Have you seen it? I haven't, but Shu has. She said it was the most impressive thing she'd ever seen. See, he's holding back his magic so Juan can have a fair fight.
It sure didn't look like he was holding back, and Juan certainly wasn't. In the end, it was the prince who stole the victory. Then it was her turn in the arena. Sweat poured in streams down her back, her neck, her chest. Her hands turned clammy, so clammy she could hardly get a grip on her staff. She swallowed, suddenly wanting to run and hide in the library.
You didn't tell me this many people would be watching, she whispered to Sedong. I'm about to be so embarrassed.
Half the people here today lose. It's all right. He reached out and squeezed her shoulder, offering a smile. She was waiting for him to assure her that she was going to win despite all the odds, but instead he just consoled her that losing wouldn't be that bad. As she walked to her arena, she watched as a student slammed another down into the ground and pinned him with ice bolts through his robes. When the second student couldn't get up, the first was proclaimed the victor. The surrounding crowd burst into cheers. It was going to be all right. Even if she lost, this would be a learning experience, right? She could improve, learn more. It would be fine. So why wouldn't her heart slow down? It pounded all the way to her assigned arena. A master was there, garbed in black, to referee the match.
Song Liena,
he called. She could still run. If only her magic was invisibility. She could slip away until this was all over. Maybe she could even remain invisible for the rest of her time here, slipping into the classes that she wanted to learn from, but no one would know. No one could make her fight. Nonsense, she muttered to herself as she stepped forward.
Wei Ling,
he called. A short, slight girl stepped out of the crowd. Her staff might have been taller than her by nearly a foot, but there was no mistaking the determination in her round, heart-shaped face.
Take your places,
said the master. Places? Sedong hadn't told her where to stand. She cast about frantically, but followed the girl into the enclosed arena. She stole a glance at the neighboring arena, at how the others were standing opposite one another. She scuffled to the side opposite where Ling stood. She could do this. Ling had only been here longer than her. The girl had no other advantage, right? After all, Liena had worked hard on a farm her whole life. She was strong. She was taller, bigger. She let out a big gust of air through her clenched teeth. She could do this. She could do this. Yes. The master brought his fingers to his mouth and whistled. The girl came flying across the arena. Liena squawked, flashing back to Shu's training from last night. She threw up her staff, dodging to the side as she did so. Her bare feet slid around in the sand and hampered her speed. Stupid sand! She needed to run away, and she needed to do it fast. There were boos from the watching crowd. Someone shouted, "Coward!" No, she wasn't a coward. She was just practical. A practical person didn't engage in a fight that she couldn't win. The girl charged again, swinging her staff out in front of her. Liena made another squeak, and when she held up her staff to defend herself, the girl knocked it out of her hands. It went flying over the rim of the arena. The crowd dodged. Weaponless, Liena stared back at the girl. She lifted her weapon, let out a yell, and charged. Liena shrieked. She ran, hating the confines of the arena. The crowd was shouting, telling her to use something, to try some type of attack she didn't know, telling her to roll under Ling's guard. What was a guard? One sound blow to her shin ripped a cry from her throat, and then she was on the ground, staring up at the victor. Ling didn't look satisfied, her brow pinched. She almost looked irritated. The crowd was booing. Did that mean they were rooting for Liena to win? Then she heard what they were saying. What a horrible fight! Worst arena battle I've seen. Her legs stung. She wasn't sure what was more humiliating, being knocked to the ground by someone 2/3 her size, or being offered a hand up by the same girl.
She swallowed her pride and accepted the boost.
Medics are that way,
said the master without looking up as he scribbled on a scroll. Lanna swallowed, trying not to limp as pain radiated up her leg with each step, and nodded at the master. Sedong was at her side the next instant.
That'll have a nasty bruise.
Feng Sedong, the encourager. He slid his arm under her shoulder blades.
Here, grab onto me. I'll help you to the medic. Yin Tai and Feng Sedong.
Liena and Sedong froze, looking at each other as her hand gripped his neck.
Your battle, she said.
Dragons, he cursed. Here, lean against this pillar. I'll help you when I'm done.
I'm not an invalid. Farm life had taught her much about working even in pain. If she wasn't feeling well while she harvested, it was just too bad. After all, if they didn't get the harvest in, they'd starve during the winter. And then she would be feeling worse. Sedong left her, hurrying toward his arena nearby. She leaned against the pillar, refusing to lean down and roll up her trousers to see if a welt had appeared. At least it wasn't broken. Liena had a sneaking suspicion that the girl could have easily broken her leg. Or even worse, aimed the blow at her knee instead. Sedong took his place opposite the burly boy, and even though he was tall, he suddenly looked small. It took her a second to realize it was because of his body language. He folded in on himself, as though braced for a beating. She ground her teeth. Was that what she'd looked like? She and Sedong had much to learn and improve on. The shrill whistle pierced the air. Sedong and his opponent circled each other, the latter almost snarling, like he was already part animal even though he hadn't shifted yet. That was when she noticed one of the tall spectators at the neighboring match. The prince. Her stomach clenched. She immediately looked away. She would focus on Sedong's match. She was just in time to watch the boy pounce. The opponent was human when he leapt, but slavering dog when he landed. He knocked Sedong backward, so hard that his back hit the arena and his neck snapped backward. Liena gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. The crowd didn't seem alarmed. They cheered. Cheered as Sedong tried to defend himself with his wooden sword. They shouted advice to both. The boy shifted again, this time a viper. And Liena thought her heart might stop in her chest. One bite. But the master only kept watching and making notes. He didn't intervene. Her heart raced, her lungs so tight she could barely breathe. Come on, Sedong. Come on. The boy shifted again, becoming an enormous, muscular tiger. Liena thought her heart would stop right then, watching as the tiger growled as Sedong scooted desperately to the back of the arena, his face wild with fear. Should she intervene? Was there anything she could do? The boy shifted back into a viper and struck at Sedong. Sedong hopped out of the way and yelled at it in a rage. Finally, Tai shifted back into his human form, knocked Sedong to the ground, and pinned him there. When the master proclaimed the winner, the boy leaned down to offer a hand to Sedong. Sedong, however, smacked it away with a snarl.
That was not fair,
he shouted, scrambling up and facing his opponent.
You can't just turn into a viper like that.
Yes, he can, said the master with lowered brows.
And if he'd bitten me, would you have just labeled it an accident?
Sedong shouted at the master.
You would have let him. You would have let him kill me.
Enough,
snapped the master.
Feng Sedong, you are dismissed for detention. Go immediately.
Sedong's face whitened, but he held his ground.
You would have been glad to be rid of me, wouldn't you? If I died, then you wouldn't have to figure out what to do with the failing student.
By that time, Liena had already hobbled over, and she reached into the arena and grabbed Sedong's arm. He reacted sharply, nearly throwing off her grip. But when he turned and saw her, his eyes widened. She gave a wince. The medics? Sedong turned to the master, but Liena tugged his attention back to her. "It's all right, just leave them," she said.
"Detention!"
snapped the master.
"Not the medics!"
Sedong's face was a murderous shade of crimson.
"It's all right," said Liena, pulling on him. "I'll go with you."
"You can't walk."
"Yes, I can," she snapped, gesturing for him to follow her. He growled, vaulted over the edge of the arena, and landed next to her. He made to storm ahead. If she hadn't grabbed onto his arm, for support, she hoped he thought, that he slowed down enough for her.
"That dragon-blasted, phoenix-scorched, cheeling-cursed idiot of a shifter! And that master is a rotten, cracked dragon egg!"
Sedong snarled. She winced at all the cursing. "It's all right. It's just a battle. They weren't going to let anything happen to you. Here, where's detention? I'll come with you."
"You are not going to detention with me."
She blinked. "Why not?" His jaw clenched, his face still pale. He shook his head.
"Don't. And don't do anything that will get you in detention. Ever."
She frowned, her heart suddenly quickening. "Why? What is it? What's wrong? Are you going to be all right? Sedong!"
"The medics are that way,"
he pointed, prying her hands off him. He stormed in the opposite direction, down a corridor darker than the rest. Chapter 8. After she visited the medics, who had almost nothing to give her except a poultice to apply at night for the bruising, Liena went to find detention and Sedong. It took some while of wandering, student-strewn hallways before she stumbled her way back to the corridor Sedong had vanished down for detention. There were no students here, only monster statues glittering in the patterned light cast from sun through decorative screens. It was eerily quiet, and as she walked deeper into these twisty hallways, it felt rather like her first day, like she was small and stupid, like she didn't belong here and never would. Voices. Footsteps. Coming from a hallway she was about to intersect. Liena froze. Her first instinct was to duck behind one of the pillars or a lattice screen nearby. She forced herself to stay where she was and kept walking. She wasn't doing anything wrong. There was no reason to hide.
"This is a bad idea," said the first voice.
"Absolutely not. He's the perfect student for it. Always in detention."
Liena's heart quickened. Were they talking about Sedong? And that second voice, she recognized it. From somewhere. It rubbed at the back of her mind, buzzing near her ears like an annoying fly.
"Why don't you use that new girl instead? There's even less to lose with her."
"I don't like her."
Master Gu. That was who the voice belonged to. Now Liena had to fight to keep her steps from faltering.
"Pfft, why?"
asked the second voice.
"She's just not as good of an option as him. Trust me on this."
They rounded the corner, straight into Liena. She blinked, halting and tilting her head back to look up at the two masters. Master Gu's good eye narrowed to a slit, and the effect was garish on the empty socket. Garish and terrifying. The other master was taller even than Master Gu, with a long, pointed nose and cleft chin. He lifted that chin at the sight of her, his sharp brow casting a shadow over his eyelids. Liena felt like a mouse caught in a trap, even though she couldn't fully articulate why.
"What are you doing, girl?"
asked Master Gu. I'm looking for Feng Sedong. Is he here somewhere?"
"He's in detention."
She bobbed her head in an acquiescing bow. "Yes, Master. I would like to visit him."
"What? Do you think detention is the infirmary? There are no visitors. Go back to your studies, girl. You don't have time to dawdle about the academy. You ought to work and catch up."
Liena pursed her lips. It was on the tip of her tongue, a question of what detention was. Instead, she ducked her head in another bow nod and scurried on to the library. She didn't see Sedong until the next morning when it was time to train in the pits. He staggered to her side, looking pale and slightly gaunt. His eyes were hollowed out, and at first, she didn't even recognize him. At breakfast, he scarfed down 2 bowls of congee in hardly a second. He never said a word to her. Sedong's moods were like weather. Fair one minute, stormy the next. She tried to be patient with him, but it was always a relief when he sat down across from her in the mess hall or the library, and he wore an easy expression on his face.
"What are you writing?"
he asked as he spread out his study materials. "Practicing my characters, writing down what I remember from history class," Liena said, smiling and folding up the parchments she'd been working on.
"Practicing more characters?"
he said with a smirk.
"You'd spend your time better practicing combat."
She glared at him. "I know. But speaking of combat, I think I'm going to go to bed now. What do you say about getting up extra early to practice?" He groaned. "Shh," she said, stifling a giggle. "Not too loud." Around them, scattered throughout the library, other students were hard at work studying. Sedong gave her a withering look, then shrugged.
"Fine, if you say so. You're making me rue the day you came and sat next to me in the mess hall."
She rolled her eyes, packed up her studies, and took her candle. "Good night." The hallway was dark. The sparse moonlight on the Mwagwe statues cast strange and terrifying shadows on the wall. Liena paused, glancing at the shadow of fangs protruding not even a full pace away on the wall from a slavering dragon mouth, a long tongue curling in the air. She looked the other way and found the statue that cast the shadow. Funny how the original object seemed so much smaller than its shadow. As dark and scary as everything looked at night, she was half tempted to curl up on the floor and fall asleep. She was so exhausted that the thought of trudging the entire way to her dormitory was daunting. Another dot of candlelight appeared around a bend ahead, and as she kept walking, the outline of the dark form beyond the pinprick became clearer. Shu grinned, stopping once they intersected. "Hi, Liena. Going to bed already?" It wasn't an already. It was a finally. Liena forced a smile anyway. "Hey, I've noticed that you've been spending so much time with Sedong," said Shu casually. Liena said nothing, fighting to keep her face neutral. Shu prattled on. "It's really kind of you to notice someone like him and spend time with him. I mean, sometimes it's just really exhausting for me to spend time with someone like him. People that I should be helping, but it's just so draining. I admire you for it." Someone like him. Liena bristled. "He's not a charity case. He's my friend." Shu blinked, then laughed a little. "Of course he is. I only meant that sometimes we have friends and sometimes we have friends." She gave a little wink as if that was supposed to explain everything. "But you might consider expanding your friendship horizons. You realize he's failing at everything, right? You don't want it to rub off, you know, especially with your situation." Her situation? Was she someone like him? "Anyway, I'd better run along. Our group is studying together tonight for our Nuances of Battle Strategy exam tomorrow. See you around." Our group. She was going to study with the prince. Jealousy had no place in the heart of someone like Liena. She growled, clutching her candle closer, and hurried on to her room. But then she turned around and was just in time to see a tall form enter the hallway and follow after the direction Shu had gone. Crown Prince Niansu was heading toward the library, and she kicked herself for abandoning it so soon in favor of early morning combat. Chapter 9. Every day, Lanna dreaded the third afternoon bell. No matter how the months trickled by in a steady stream of unrelenting days and exhausted nights, her stomach did not fail to drop to her toes when that bell rang. It signaled that it was time for her combat class. After practicing early that morning, her legs felt like mush. It didn't seem to matter how hard she pushed herself or if she slacked off for a few days. She was constantly aching. The last thing she needed was to keep exercising. But when she entered class that afternoon, her heart immediately lurched. Normally, the room was empty save for the 3 masters who taught this class. Instead, there was a row of students on the opposite side of the room, facing the new set of students. They were all really large students. Tall, broad, strong students. Not all of them were male either. There were some very scary and intimidating female students in the lineup as well. What made her heart lurch was realizing that Prince Niansu was one of them. What was he doing here in her combat class? Was he going to watch her fail over and over again? Oh, fathers, please no. Of all the classes he had to attend. But what was he even doing here? 2 of the masters had tiny, smug grins on their faces. The third was solemn and stern as usual.
Stop dawdling by the door, students. Take your places.
Liena had her assigned spot. It was at the far end, near the stern master. And across from her spot, her heart raced, her blood pounding like she'd just finished this difficult class, rather than only started it. The prince was across from her. It was a small mercy that he wasn't looking at her. Instead, he watched the stern master, Master Yijun. The prince's legs were planted wide, his hands clasped behind him, and his shoulders set back. Fathers, he seemed even bigger up close. Though the room was full of intimidating students, he was definitely the largest. She wasn't typically a fainter, but she considered faking it. After all, if she passed out, they would have to take her to the medics, right? Then the prince wouldn't see her fail so terribly. Would it be any less embarrassing for him to watch her swoon? She clenched her jaw and twisted her sash in her clammy hands.
Students,
said Master Yijun, striding down between the 2 rows of students with his hands behind his back.
We've spent the last few weeks covering the basics of grappling techniques. You've been practicing on each other thus far. But in the real world, you will not be paired with someone your same skill level and size. You must learn to fight someone larger than you. You must learn to come to a fight disadvantaged and win. Or at least, make it out alive.
He gave them each a weighty, narrow-eyed look. Now, Liena might truly faint. The master had reached the end of the line and turned around, walking back purposefully.
Remember what we've taught you so far. When encountering an opponent while disadvantaged, it is especially important to keep your mind under your control. No panicking, no fear.
Of course, the master had to look directly at her when he said no fear. And of course, the prince had to glance her way when he did so. She kept her features neutral by grinding her teeth with enough force to break them.
You breathe, continued the master. You assess the situation. You look for weak spots. You think creatively. And remember, sometimes the best option is to avoid engaging.
Liena glanced at the mountain of a prince before her.
I opt to avoid engaging,
said a student a few down from her. There were a few scattered chuckles. I second, muttered Liena under her breath. The master reached the end of his pace and turned half-lidded eyes on the speaker. He smiled and snapped his fingers.
Begin.
Leanna's eyes went wide, and she darted back a few steps as many of the larger students burst forward and tackled their opponents. The prince met her eyes for one split second before he moved. His brow was slightly furrowed. He lunged. She squeaked, jumping backward, and turned to run. "No running!" snapped one of the other masters, whacking her arm with a long stick. She gasped at the sudden burn, but didn't have time to do anything else. Her wrist was snatched, her legs clipped out from beneath her, and she hit the ground. She didn't impact with the force to knock all the air out of her lungs. Instead, she was almost gently flattened. She realized belatedly that the prince had caught her ankle in his other hand and lowered her to the ground so she wasn't hurt. It was still swift, still effective, still discombobulating, but far less jarring.
"Don't go so easy on her, Highness,"
said one of the masters. The prince released her ankle, glancing up at the master. Was that a glare? She wasn't sure. She didn't have time to consider it either, because then he had straddled her waist, caught both of her wrists, and pinned them to the ground above her head. She blinked, staring open-mouthed up at his face as he held her pinned beneath him. His very, very handsome face. A face that was extremely close to hers. "Oof," she said when his weight pressed on her stomach. He shifted his weight to his knees. Half of her mind was devoted to trying to wriggle free of his iron grip, and the other half was screaming, "The prince is on my stomach! The crown prince!" Again, he wasn't even looking at her, though. He was watching the master, gaze flicking back to her every so often.
"He's got you pinned, Liena,"
said the youngest master. "Obviously."
"How are you going to get out of it?"
he challenged.
"With one move, he can kill you."
Demonstrating, the prince leaned forward, shifting his grip so he pinned both her wrists with one hand instead of two, freeing his second to pantomime holding a knife to her throat. She exhaled a large, irritated breath through her nose. "I am aware of my peril," she gritted out. "I do not know how to free myself from it." But the master had moved on to the next student, saying nearly the same thing to him. Lanna peered up at the prince and chewed on her lip, her heart nearly roaring out of her chest. She found herself gazing over his shoulder at the wooden rafters, trying to collect her composure. She had to keep a clear head. If only she had an uglier opponent, that would make focusing easier. "I'm not pinning your legs," said the prince, letting his free hand fall to his side. It was so infuriating how he was just sitting there, looking so casual while she struggled with all her might. "Try to dislodge me with them." "I'm not sure they will help much against you," she said honestly. He grinned then, and her thundering heart came to a screeching halt. It was a beautiful smile, and the hard angles of his face melted into something entirely different. He even had dimples.
"At least bring them up,"
he said, still smiling. She bent her knees, tilting her face away from him in hopes that he wouldn't see her blush. He switched his grip, so he was holding one wrist in each hand, pinning them beside her head again. She gave a few half-hearted wriggles, embarrassment taking over her other emotions. "I don't know how," she finally said, gasping.
"Use your hips to throw me forward," he said. "It's all about balance. See how I'm balanced well on my hands and knees? You need to throw me off. That's when you can get out."
She grunted, trying to shove up, but he felt like a giant boulder on her midsection.
"Use your legs to push up."
"You're too heavy!" Then, a second later, Your Highness." He smirked at that, then shifted more of his weight to his knees, making it easier for her to push up on her legs. This time, it actually worked. He fell forward and caught himself with his grip on her wrists.
"Better,"
he said, shifting back again to her stomach.
"When you do that, sweep your arms down to the side. It forces me to let go of your wrists to catch myself. Then you can free yourself."
Like this?
She tried again. Faster. You have to catch me by surprise.
It was rude to glare at the future emperor, right? She remembered that too late. He only raised an eyebrow and told her to try again. That time didn't work either, and she wasn't sure if it was because she was doing it wrong or he was simply too big to dislodge. Finally, he sat back on his heels and said,
Would you like me to show you?
She hadn't answered before he was climbing off her and sitting down next to her.
Let's trade positions, he said. I'll show you how the motion is supposed to work, and then we'll go back again.
She pushed herself up to her knees. I'm supposed to... Curse this blush on her face. Was the prince the sort who noticed these things, or was he more oblivious? She prayed he was oblivious.
Highness, what are you doing?
Came the youngest master's voice right as Liena straddled the prince's waist, face as hot as an oven. It blazed even hotter with those words.
I know what I'm doing,
snapped the prince, not even glancing at the master.
He's new,
he muttered to her.
Drives me insane.
She blinked.
Now, pin my arms,
said the prince. But that meant getting even closer. Timidly, she leaned forward and gripped his wrists, settling as much of her weight as possible into that grip.
Be sure to catch yourself.
He moved so quickly she wasn't sure what was happening. 1 second, she was astride him, and the next, she barely managed to catch herself before she fell face first into the floor. She rolled to the side so her stomach wasn't in his face.
See? That's what you need to do to me.
I didn't...
We'll do it again, but slower.
This time, he did things one by one, slowly, with a break in between so she could understand. He pushed up on his legs, throwing her off balance, and swept his hands down to his side so she was forced to break her hold to catch herself from face-planting. When they switched places and she finally did it right, he said,
There you go.
He was smiling again. She grinned back.
Now,
he said as he shifted back to his knees again.
You have to get me out of this position. If you're not fast enough, I can catch my balance, pull back, and land a punch to your face.
He pantomimed the blow.
So, you need to grab hold of me around the waist to prevent me from regaining my balance, and then you have to—
Switch!
Cried a master. The prince pulled himself up before offering her a hand. She hesitated for a split second. Then she placed her hand in his, and he hoisted her up. They bowed to each other, and she watched as the large student shuffled. Shu was across from her now. And Shu didn't soften the first blow when she knocked Lanna off her feet. Chapter 10. The next morning in the pits, Lanna tried to practice with Sedong the thing she'd learned in yesterday's combat class, but they kept fighting through it all. No, Sedong, I'm trying to practice this maneuver, not the one where you pin my legs. I need to master this before I can do that. Why not do this one? Just try it. Because I don't want to do that one. Back and forth they bickered until Shu approached, grinning. Behind her, her two sidekicks trailed. If you practice just with each other, neither of you will improve, she said. You'll never know what your blind spots are unless you fight with more people. Sedong's eyes flashed. Apparently this morning he was the contrarian. He stood, disentangling himself from Liena, and faced Shu with wide-planted legs. A duel, then, he snapped. Shu's eyebrows shot up. Why, it would be my pleasure. Before she had a chance to brace herself, Sedong was plunging toward her with one of the wooden swords. Liena sucked in a gasp, scooting out of the way. Warning bells blared in her mind, but there wasn't anything she could do, was there? Shu clamped her hands together swiftly. There was a loud popping sound, and the air glimmered around her. Sedong smashed into a glittering force field. Just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Shu's fist shot forward where the force field had just been and landed a blow straight to his mouth. His head knocked backwards sharply, and bloody spit flew from his lips. Liena was a hair's breadth from shouting for it to stop. Sedong snarled, plunging his sword back toward her again. The force field flew back up, blocking every blow. Each moment that he was unbalanced because of his own blows, she struck. "Enough!" Liena cried, scrambling to her feet and preparing to intervene.
Stay back,
growled Sedong, wiping blood from his face.
or I'll hit you too.
Liena drew back sharply as Shu laughed. "But you wouldn't hurt her, right?" said Shu. "She's your friend, and if you hurt her, you wouldn't have anyone to help you study." Those words sent a fire blazing down Liena's spine. Apparently, it was the same for Sedong, because he let out a cry and barreled toward Shu in another fruitless effort. Shu hit him so hard with her force fields that he was flung backward to the ground. She stood over him, picking up his fallen sword and shoving it against his throat. "I win," she said with a smile. "Good practice, though." Sedong looked like he might murder her. Liena ran to his side. "Don't worry about her," she said with false joviality. "I've never seen someone with force fields before. We should watch how other people fight her to get an idea of—" Sedong jerked his arm away from her.
Stop trying to make me feel better, he snapped.
She let go, lips parting as she stared at him. "I think I'll just go," said Shu, cringing. Her ever-near friends giggled, Lei almost bursting out in full-on laughter. "You're bleeding," said Liena, turning her sleeve inside out and dabbing at his split lip.
I'll do it myself,
he said, shoving away her hand and pressing his own sleeve to his mouth. His breath came fast, his scowl turning his features downward. "I'm sorry," she said, swallowing hard. It made no sense that she suddenly wanted to cry, but she did. It almost seemed like Sedong was angry with her, not Shu. He glared at her. Maybe he was angry with her. Maybe he wasn't just taking his anger out on her. But if she was only a friend to Sedong when he was helping her, or things were easy between them, then what kind of friend was she? A fair-weather feather, as they called them back home. Perhaps he needed a moment to himself, though. "I'll go fetch some water for you," she said quietly. He didn't stop her. She got up and hurried away, the urge to cry stronger than before. She dashed her unbloodied sleeve across her eyes and swallowed. This wasn't about her. She shouldn't make it about her. That started with not feeling sorry for herself. On her way back with a water skin, she rounded a corner near the lotus pond and very nearly froze in her footsteps. The prince was ahead, striding down the covered walkway, sweat dripping off his nose and sticking his garments to his torso. To her surprise, he glanced her way, just happening to meet her gaze. Did he just do a double take on her? He was too late to know for sure since his gaze quickly fixed ahead. She shook her head, blinking, and finished hurrying toward Sedong. She knelt next to him, not quite looking at him as she handed him the water. "It's not very cold, but I hope—"
"Do you like the prince?"
Sedong asked. Now she did meet his eyes, hers wide and rounded. His were narrowed.
No.
Then why were you staring? It was a valid question. How had he noticed that? She'd paused for hardly a second. And if Sedong had noticed, who else might have noticed too? Her cheeks heated. "I suppose I'm curious," she said, lowering her head. Sedong snorted.
"You and every other girl here."
"No!" she cried, a little too insistent. To be lumped in with every other girl? It turned her own mouth sour. Sedong's mood was getting to her.
"Well, if things don't go well with the Crown Prince Niansu,"
said Sedong with a dark lift of his lips,
"there are at least a dozen other princes running around here. And princesses, too. Hey, they might be in some of your classes. Even if they're years younger, you might graduate at the same time."
Did he mean that to sting? She actually thought he might have. She chewed on her lips. "Do you feel any better?" she asked. "I'm fine," he said, clambering to his feet. Sometimes she forgot how tall he was until they were standing close together, and she had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes. Not as tall as Nianzu, and far lankier, but he was still much larger than her. Large enough to easily best her in a fight, even unskilled as he was. But Sedong wouldn't hurt her, no matter how angry he was. Not physically, that is. Liena turned away, hands twisting in her sash. "I suppose we should go to breakfast." Chapter 11. Liena was on extra alert during her first poisons and foreign substances class. It didn't matter how much her body ached or how exhausted she was. She refused to let her mind drift for even an instant. She wouldn't be one of the students that became a warning to the next generation of students.
"In a month," said the master, "once we have covered all our material, we will have an exam where you must identify different poisons by smell and appearance."
One of the students nearby let out a relieved sigh. He turned to his neighbor and whispered loud enough for Liena to hear.
"I'm so glad we have this master instead of Master Lin Zhou. Because I heard he made his students arrange the poisons in order of most lethal to least, and then made the students drink what they thought was the least lethal."
"Did they have the antidotes on hand?"
"For the poisons they have antidotes for,"
replied the first student.
"Silence!"
snapped the master at front.
"Whispering in class! Detention!"
Both the students' faces went white. Everyone else turned stiff as statues. No one made a sound, but the atmosphere in the room was palpable. Detention? Just for this? Dread welled up in Liena's chest, but she didn't move. Neither did the offending students.
"Detention!"
cried the master.
"Off with you!"
The two students looked like they'd seen a Mwagwe. But slowly, they rose from their mats and, with bowed faces, turned and exited the room. It appeared everyone else but her knew what detention was. She wasn't sure she wanted to find out. She glanced toward the doorway where the students disappeared. To her surprise, there was Master Gu, staring with her one good eye straight at Liena. Her heart leapt to her throat, though not from excitement. The master turned, escorting the two students toward detention. That night, when it was finally time for supper, Liena tried to find Sedong, weaving her way through the tables toward their typical spot, when a voice cut through the din of the mess hall.
"Hey, do you know if barbarians are allowed at the academy?"
Liena might have had knives shoved through her feet, nailing her to the floor, for how quickly she froze. She glanced toward the speaker, finally recognizing her as one of Shu's followers. It was Shu who replied,
"What kind of question is that? Barbarians can't wield magic."
And then, in a flash, Sedong was at her side, his face an alarming shade of scarlet.
"Don't talk about her like that!"
He snarled at Shu and the other girl. Liena wanted to melt into the floor and vanish. She could only hope the prince was not here yet. Oh, he was. He was a few tables down, looking straight at Liena with a frown. Just kill me now, she thought with mortification. Shu's eyebrow arched innocently, her eyes sliding to Liena.
"Talk about who? Liena? Wait, is she a barbarian? I guess that explains the accent."
Her accent was that obvious? Sedong was about to throw a punch at Shu, his swollen lip and bruised face not a deterrent at all. And Liena couldn't watch that happen again. If he hadn't shown up, Liena wouldn't have been singled out. It didn't matter that she was only part barbarian. The nuance apparently didn't count. Now, Sedong had shouted it to the world. It's all right, let's just go, said Lanna, grabbing his elbow and pulling him away. This time she succeeded. Her shoulders nearly sagged in relief. But as they made their way through the now much quieter mess hall toward their spot, she realized he was trembling, shaking like a leaf caught up in an autumn gale. Had he ever stood up for someone else before? Someone besides himself? It is all right, she whispered again, sitting across from him like usual. The mat beneath her felt extra thin and threadbare now, and she kept readjusting to get comfortable. It's not a big deal. Let's just eat. His shaking had grown worse, and now it was so bad he could hardly lift a pair of chopsticks. Sedong,
My magic worked, he snarled. I heard them speaking to each other, trying to make fun of you. It was intentional.
Song Liena!
Lanna and Sedong both jumped at the sound of her name boomed across the mess hall. She didn't want to look up, didn't want to see the form she knew that voice belonged to. But she couldn't delay, not with the scene they were making in front of the entire academy. Her face burning, she got to her feet.
Lanna,
Sedong hissed. She cast a helpless look at him, then bowed her head and shuffled back through the tables to where Master Gu stood waiting for her.
Come with me,
said the master, turning on her heel and marching out of the mess hall. Liena wound her hand into her sash and followed, ducking her head even lower. If she was going to detention for doing nothing, they went to a darker corner of the academy, an echoey place where no other students or masters were. Then Master Gu grabbed both of Liena's arms and dragged her close enough to smell sour mint and crushed ginger on her breath.
You've been nothing but a problem since you arrived,
snarled the master.
I'd send you to detention for the scene you caused in there.
But I didn't cause the scene, she wanted to protest.
Instead, no supper. You need to learn to not drag others down with your problems. You are behind, and you need to focus on catching up. You don't have time to get involved with friends and enemies, girl. Now off with you.
That didn't seem reasonable. Nevertheless, Lanna drew in a deep breath through her nose as she made her way toward the library. The moment she was safely out of view from Master Gu, she clenched her hands into fists.